Thank you very much. Let's get to our seats. Once again, welcome. And to start off our meeting, I would like to welcome HBS Director Joachim Paul to give the welcoming remarks.
Thank you, Arun. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for being here with us. Professor William Mosley, honorable members of the East African Legislative Assembly, distinguished guests, representatives of government, academia, civil society. There are many civil societies here, organizations here I can see. Development partners, farmers' organizations, students, my colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Heinrich Böll Foundation office in Nairobi, I'm very pleased to welcome you, and it's my great pleasure to have you all here attending the public lecture on East African Policy Dialogue, or the East African Policy Dialogue on Decolonizing African Agriculture, Food Security, Agroecology, and the Future of Food Systems in East Africa. Now we are talking about decolonizing. So I don't think it should be my role to give you a long speech or lecture here, but I would still like to welcome our guest and also our panelists, and just say a few words about the Böll Foundation. Today's gathering here reflects what lies at the heart of Heinrich Böll Foundation's work, creating spaces where civil society, scholarship, public policy, lived experience, and democratic dialogue come together to address some of the defining challenges of our time, and especially here in Kenya, in Uganda, in Tanzania, and the East African region. I would especially extend a very warm welcome to Professor Mosley. Here. Professor Mosley is the David Wallace Professor of Geography at Macalester College in the United States, a former president of the American Association of Geographers, and the author of numerous influential books and scholarly publications examining food security, rural livelihood, and environmental change across the African continent. I would also like to warmly welcome our panelists. We have today with us here Dr. Gloria Otieno. She is an agroecology researcher and expert at the organization CIAT here in Nairobi. We have Dr. David Kabanda, who is the executive director of CFROD in Uganda. Welcome. We do have Ms. Marie Waihenya. Sorry? Oh, I'm sorry. Agroecological practitioner and frequent participant in our panels. Thank you for being here. And we have Honorable Gatpa Gideon, chairperson of the committee, the Parliamentary Committee on Agriculture, Tourism and Natural Resources of the East African Parliament. We're especially honored by your presence here today, Honorable Gideon. With these words, I don't want to bore you any longer, but to hand over to my colleague, Dr. Harun Warui, who will say a few words on behalf of our office and the Heinrich Böll Foundation here. Dr. Warui is the Senior Program Coordinator at the Heinrich Böll Foundation at our office in Nairobi on agroecology and food rights. Harun, please.
Thank you. Thank you, our Director Joachim. all protocols observed, I would like to start by welcoming you again to this lecture, and start by saying that over the past few days, as we shared this event publicly, one question emerged from most of our participants. And that was, why are we still talking about decolonization of African agriculture? Some asked whether we should instead discuss mechanization, cold chains, agriculture machinery, exports, logistics, and international markets. Others questioned whether African agriculture itself needs decolonization. Still others asked whether the very composition of today's panel reflects conversation we seek to have. Mr. Bill? So I think those are very burning questions from the public. But these are open-minded questions, which we truly encourage for that kind of an interaction between us and the public that will be joining us today. In fact, they are precisely why we are here today. Perhaps the more important question is not whether the modern agriculture within Africa we must absolutely follow is a must. The deeper question is whether our agriculture systems are ultimately serving African farmers, African households, and African food security in the way we intend. Are they? Why do communities farming some of Africa's most fertile land still struggle with food insecurity? That's one of the questions that we are struggling with. Why do some highly commercial agriculture systems generate export earnings, yet leave farming households increasingly dependent on food purchased from elsewhere? Allow me, colleagues, to reflect on what's happening on our land. Look at central Kenya, where we have tea. Still, we have food insecurity. Are we asking ourselves why? Yet they're exporting a lot of that. Look at our coffee belts. We still have food insecurity. Could be chronic sometimes, but it's still there. I wonder why we don't hear about food insecurity in some places in Western Kenya, like Kakamega, Bungoma, whereby communities there have been able to embrace a lot of diversity in terms of what they plant, from underground to above ground. Does that challenge us as Kenyans, Ugandans, Tanzanians? Does that challenge us? How do we reconcile agricultural success measured by production and exports with the lived realities of nutrition, resilience, and household food security? So colleagues, these are some of the questions that are lingering in our minds when we reflect on the talk today and when we read the book by Professor Mosley. So these are not questions with simple answers, nor are they questions that can be answered by rejecting science, technology, and global markets. Rather, these questions invite us to reflect on whether our policies, research, institutions, and investments are sufficiently grounded in African realities, knowledge systems, and aspirations. So that's where we are as Kenyans, participants from Uganda, participants from Tanzania, and Africa as a whole. At the Heinrich Böll Foundation, we believe that meaningful transformations begin with courage to ask difficult questions. Today's dialogue is therefore not intended to prescribe answers. It is intended to create a space where scholarship, policy, practice, and lived experience can challenge one another respectively, and we hope to move us closer to better answers. So these are the kind of issues we would like this kind of dialogue based on the keynote speak from Professor Mosley will be able to ignite our thoughts through. Today's dialogue is therefore been deliberately designed as a conversation rather than a lecture alone. So we would like the lecture we are going to have to provoke the kind of discussion, policy dialogue we are going to have today. That's why this conversation brings together a group of East African voices representing complementary perspective and essential to this debate. Colleagues, during this discussion, We are going to have our moderator, Sam Gituku, one of the Kenya's most respected journalists and public dialogue facilitator. Following the keynote lecture, Sam will lead an interactive East Africa conversation, drawing together the perspectives of our conversation partners while creating opportunities for questions and contributions from both our in-person and online audience. So please, our online audience, you are fully welcome to participate in this event. Ladies and gentlemen, it's now my pleasure to invite our keynote speaker, Professor William Mosley, who is the former president of American Association of Geographers and one of the world's leading scholars in Africa food systems, agroecology, and agricultural development. So on behalf of the Boyle Foundation, Nairobi, the Root to Food Initiative, and all our partners who are represented here, and I would like to thank you so much, our partners of the Root to Food Initiative, for joining us in this forum. It's my pleasure to invite you, Prof, to deliver the keynote public lecture this morning. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much for that kind and gracious introduction. I want to thank the Heinrich Boll Foundation for organizing this event, the Route to Food Initiative, and especially Harun Waruri, who initially approached me several months ago, and I told him this morning I've been so impressed by how thoughtfully this conversation has been put together. It's wonderful to be back in Kenya, in the beautiful city of Nairobi. I just spent the past 8 or 9 days in a rural village in the Mara region of Tanzania. So I must confess, I just arrived this morning and I feel like the country mouse in the big city. I'm still adapting to this environment. So what I'm going to share today are sort of a synopsis, a broad outline of a book that was published a little over a year ago. And this book was my attempt to take a step back from a 35-year career, initially as an agricultural development worker and then as an academic, and to think about what's working and what's not working in terms of ameliorating or improving African food security and agriculture. And hopefully along the way, provoke policymakers into considering some alternatives. And I think there are two aspects of my positionality that I need to address before I get started. And Harun sort of hinted at this. I'm a white male from the global north, writing about African food security and agricultural development. And I bring a set of life experiences to this topic that are different than someone who was born and raised on the continent. And while I have spent well over a decade living in different African countries, I often did so as a privileged outsider. Secondly, it's also clear to me that African policymakers do not operate in a vacuum. They're operating in this policy ecosystem composed of governments, donors, NGOs, international institutions, think tanks, universities, and I have worked for many of these organizations. And clearly, my experiences with those organizations have shaped my perspective on this topic. But what you're going to discover is that I am deeply critical of the role that several of these institutions have played in shaping African food security and agriculture. I also want to acknowledge that these organizations are not monolithic. There are lots of good people that work for them, but in some cases they've pushed problematic approaches because of the way they were trained or the constraints that they're operating under. So, I'm going to start out with the origins of my thinking on this project. I have a short story related to that. I then will describe my thesis, There are 4 aspects of the theoretical framing that I want to touch on. I'll say a few things, big picture, about food insecurity in the world and on the African continent, but then I'm going to dive into some case studies showing you what I think has gone wrong, and then I'm going to revisit the same case studies and show you some hopes for the future, what I think is a potential way forward. And then I'm going to end by talking about, I'm going to zoom out and talk about the international context before I conclude. So, a little bit about sort of the origins of my thinking on this project. So I served as a United States Peace Corps volunteer for 2.5 years in Mali between 1987 and 1989. And I was an agricultural volunteer there to promote gardening and sustainable agriculture. And after I went through several months of training, I landed in this small village of 200 people in the southern part of Mali. And there I met my government counterpart, who was the agricultural extension agent. And if I'm honest, I think he found my interest in vegetable production and sustainable agriculture sort of amusing, because for him, he was focused on the real business of producing cotton. And it took me a long time to understand what was going on. Every month, all the ag extension agents, we'd have these meetings. We only talked about one crop, cotton, right? We never talked about food crops, and these sort of endless discussions about meeting quotas. And I thought I was working for the Ministry of Agriculture. Turns out I was working for the Ministry of Cotton. That's a joke, by the way, all right? So I subsequently came to understand that Mali had signed agreements with the World Bank to pursue structural adjustment in exchange for loans. And part of this commitment that the country was making was this extreme focus on cotton production, for which it was deemed to have a comparative advantage. And there are several points in the 1990s where Mali is the leading producer of cotton in all of West Africa. So I would subsequently return. I did my master's thesis research. I did my PhD research in Mali. I was really interested in this question of cotton production and the interplay with food crops. And I interviewed a large number of civil servants, and I remember they would say to me in French, "Grâce à la CMDT, nos fonctionnaires sont payés." Because of the government cotton company, our civil servants are paid. Or when I was talking to ag extension agents, they would tell me in the local language, "Bambara, koritigiye nyotigiye." The big cotton producers are the big millet or sorghum producers. There's this idea that there was a synergy, supposedly, between cash crop production and food crop production. And it was true. Cotton did help the government of Mali meet many of its financial obligations. However, it was also leading many farmers to become indebted. It was destroying the soil, and subsequent research I did showed that it was only the wealthiest farmers where there's this synergy between cash crop and food crop production. For many others, they were becoming increasingly food insecure. So, this leads me to one of the central conundrums of the book. How is it that civil servants, in this case largely trained in crop science or agronomy, were dispensing advice to farmers which ultimately was not good for them? And the answer I'm going to suggest is that the science of agronomy is not apolitical, but rather it's infused with power and politics. In other words, it can be argued that agronomists have focused on developing specific crops with specific traits, and those choices, those breeding choices, have been impacted by those who have power, money, and influence. And so I don't think we can begin to decolonize African agriculture until we understand this dynamic. So there's 3 parts to my thesis that I want to touch on here. The first is that we are not going to seriously address hunger or food insecurity in the African context until we more fully question the assumption that producing more crops alone is the solution. Because we increasingly understand that food security has 6 dimensions. availability, access, stability, utilization, sustainability, and agency. And the conventional approach has only addressed one of those dimensions, right? It's like trying to sit on a chair with one leg, right? It's difficult, it doesn't work very well. Second part of this thesis, that agricultural development must be seen as more than the first step in the industrial development process. So, and we find this in theoretical frameworks in both the West and the East. So many of you are probably familiar with modernization theory, Rostow's stages of economic development, the second figure here on the right, and there's this idea that you commercialize agriculture and then the capital surplus gets invested in industrialization. We find the same thing in the East with China's firing from the bottom strategy. You're going to commercialize agriculture so you can get industrialization, right? And I'm arguing here that we need to think about agriculture differently as a sustainable livelihood in and of itself and not just a step to something else. And then the third part of my thesis is that an agroecological approach combined with good governance will allow people to have greater control over their food systems, produce healthy food more sustainably, and enhance access to food by the poorest of the poor. Okay, there are four kind of important theoretical framings that I just want to briefly review, right? And Haroon has already hinted at one of these is decolonization. And oftentimes when we think about decolonization, we're thinking about political decolonization, this process that unfolded after World War II in the African context. And here I'm talking about intellectual colonization and intellectual decolonization, right? And the idea here is that in many of our disciplines, right, the central ideas often date back to the colonial period. And these ideas in these disciplines, these academic disciplines, are often based on shaky science, racial prejudice, a belief that the European experience could be extrapolated and applied in different parts of the world, or the prerogatives of colonial empires. And while these ideas are often inaccurate or problematic, right, they oftentimes get perpetuated over time with little scrutiny. And I think this is a problem in all disciplines, including my own discipline of geography, but I think it's a particular problem for the applied sciences. And here I'm talking about forestry, agronomy, water resources management, public health, because it's those sciences that were most closely connected to the colonial enterprise. So if I would argue we're going to see a shift in agricultural practices, I also think we need to see a shift in the ideas and worldviews that are behind them, right? And the image here on the right is of the Roads Must Fall demonstrations in South Africa. These occurred in 2015. They started out at the University of Cape Town campus, and they wanted to tear down the statue of Cecil Rhodes, who is this huge booster, as you all well know, of British colonialism. And this movement caught the country and the world's attention, leading to this growing understanding or recognition that higher education in South Africa was deeply colonial. Second idea is political agronomy. And political agronomy it's an interdisciplinary conversation, and it's acknowledging that development-oriented agronomy, which was originally tropical agronomy, has its roots in Europe and was driven by the need for colonial powers to capture and modify tropical crops, soils, and farming practices as fuel for European economic expansion. The third theoretical framework that I'm drawing on is political ecology. And here, the short definition for this is the political economy of human-environment interactions. And there are three aspects of it that I want to highlight. The first is a multi-scalar perspective, right? So think about a farmer in their farm field, right? They are not operating in a vacuum. They don't just decide to grow cotton in a particular way. They're influenced by government policies, they're influenced by regional trading relationships, They're influenced by the programs of international institutions, right? Second aspect that I think is important is to think about the way humans are interacting with the environment is a coupled human-environment system, right? And political economy influences how we experience the environment. And the classic example of this is in the Sahelian region, south of the Sahara. Historically, rainfall has for literally centuries has been very erratic. So when people had a good year, they would save surplus crops so that they could get through the bad years. Colonialism dismantles all of that. You get head taxes. People have to grow cash crops to pay for those taxes, or they have to migrate to work, and they're disincentivized in terms of storing surplus crops. So now when the drought comes, they experience the full brunt of that environmental situation. And the third aspect of political ecology that's important is gender. So socially constructed gender roles influence how we move through the environment. So in many rural areas, in the African context, it's women, for example, that are responsible for collecting firewood. Well, if there's deforestation, they have to go further and further away, spend more time collecting that firewood. Or if it's their responsibility for collecting water and the water table is dropping, then they spend more time collecting water. So gender influences how you experience the environment. And the last framework I'm drawing on is agroecology. And I realize we probably have many agroecological experts in the room, but what I want to highlight here is that it is both a science and a social movement. So as a science, agroecologists think about a farm field as a modified ecosystem. And they study the ecological relationships between different crops, crops in the soil, crops and insects, and they figure out where the synergies are, and you leverage those so you can produce more healthy food more sustainably. This is the way I was initially introduced to agroecology as a graduate student in the early 1990s. And for a long time, I was resistant to the idea that it was also a social movement. But I have changed my views because the dominant agricultural development paradigm is supported by very powerful interests. And if you want to change that paradigm, you need a social movement behind you if we're going to get that shift. So I think it is also very importantly a social movement. And lastly, I argue in the book that agroecology is a more decolonial approach. And it straddles, and I want to be careful here, some people conflate agroecology with sort of traditional knowledge. And it's more than that, right? So agroecologists draw on the lived experience of farmers. I think of farmers as scientists. They're constantly experimenting, trying to develop new approaches. And so that informal knowledge, right? And then we have the more formal science that occurs in universities and laboratories. And agroecology is drawing on both. It's a bridge between these two worlds. And because of that, I would argue that it is a more decolonial approach. So, I just want to say a few things, big picture, about the global food system today, all right? About 1 in 10 people in the world today suffer from food insecurity. In terms of absolute numbers, the largest number of food insecure people are found in South Asia, but in terms of a proportion of the population, it's the African continent. About 1 in 5 Africans suffer from food insecurity. And you are all aware of the fact that we have the Sustainable Development Goals, SDG 2, zero hunger by 2030. The clock started ticking in 2015. We have actually been moving in the wrong direction. We have moved from about 45% of the African population to almost 60% that suffer from moderate to severe food insecurity. So something is not working. And that you can see how Africa stands out on the bar graph on the right with its higher levels of food insecurity. So the way we have responded, and colleagues and I have written several papers on this, is that every time there's a crisis, we have tended to respond by producing more. That's the solution, right? So the 60s and 70s, We have the first wave of the Green Revolution. This mostly impacts Latin America and Asia. Then we have the third world debt crisis in the late 70s, which leads to structural adjustment and this real focus on export-oriented agriculture. We have the global food crisis of 2007, 2008, which creates this space for the new green revolution for Africa to emerge, right? Which is good in some ways. It's more focused on women, it's more focused on African crops, but it is still a productionist approach, which relies on lots of inputs. And more recently, we've had COVID, we've had the war in Ukraine, we've had the war in Iran. And what we're finding is that we have created a global food system that is heavily dependent on a few major bread baskets and energy-intensive trade, right? And so this is a very vulnerable system to all different sorts of shocks, pandemics, wars, energy price hikes. So in the book, I take a deep dive into 4 countries. I'm only going to talk about 3 today, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Botswana, because we don't have enough time to get into all 4. I think it's a nice sort of spread of different types of African countries. So both Mali and Burkina Faso are former French colonies. They're dominated by smallholder agriculture. Botswana, South Africa are former British colonies. Botswana is animal husbandry is very important. It also is rapidly urbanizing. And South Africa is a former or white settler colony where commercial oriented agriculture is very significant. So I'm going to talk about Mali, Burkina Faso, Botswana, tell you what's going wrong, and then I'm going to revisit these same countries and try to give you some reasons for hope. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with Mali. It gets independence in 1960. Like I said, it's a former French colony. It has about 20 million people. It is rapidly urbanizing, but it is still a predominantly rural country. Agriculture is very important. Cotton, gold are its primary exports. And what's interesting is that cotton has deep pre-colonial roots. Of course, cotton was originally domesticated in the African context. And in the pre-colonial period, it was primarily women who grew cotton. It was intercropped in small gardens. And it was a perennial variety of cotton. And that fiber, they would then trade with local weavers who produced textiles. This changes in the French colonial period. And the French, who were heavily reliant in the mid-19th century on the United States for cotton, there's an American Civil War. Cotton stops flowing to Europe. This is a huge problem. So the French want other secure sources of cotton. And so they focus on a number of their colonies in West Africa in order to develop a cotton industry. So the first thing they have to do is destroy the local textile industry. So they flood it with cheap textiles. And then they begin introducing new forms of cotton. They originally tried to grow irrigated cotton along the Niger River, but by the 1950s, they're focused on the southern part of the country with rain-fed varieties. And they kind of doubled down on this in the post-colonial period with structural adjustment, this idea of growing more and more cotton. And in Mali, there's something known as the Sikasso paradox. Sikasso is the southernmost region of Mali. It's where they grow the most cotton. It is the wealthiest rural area of the country, yet it has the highest rates of child malnutrition. Subsequent research I've undertaken shows that the largest farmers, the wealthiest farmers, in a statistically significant way, they use more insecticides, they use more fertilizers, they have larger farms. A greater proportion of those farms is dedicated to cotton. But intensive use of inorganic fertilizers without using enough compost, without using enough manure, leads to a problem known as soil acidification. So yields are declining. So in the southern part of the country, on the map of Mali here on the right, they start out in area A near Burkina Faso. This is what they call the Old Cotton Basin. Yields start to decline. They move to area B, south of the capital city, Bamako, and then eventually they move into the cotton frontier. So they are not coming up with sustainable solutions. They keep moving into new areas in order to produce more cotton. right? So what I want you to take away from this mini case study that I've described is that several decades of pushing cotton as a rural development tool in Mali has been detrimental for the environment, and the wealth that has been generated has not translated to improvements in food security. Next country, Burkina Faso. Similar in many ways to Mali. Cotton is big, gold is big, but here I want to focus on the new green revolution for Africa. And like many countries in West Africa, with urbanization, diets have been changing. People have moved away from traditional coarse grains in the city like sorghum, millet, and they're consuming more and more rice, right? This is a huge problem in 2007, 2008. The price of rice almost doubles. There are food riots or food demonstrations in a number of West African cities, and this is a huge problem for Burkina Faso. And then along comes the Gates Foundation with the New Green Revolution for Africa, and they say, we can solve your problem. We can help you produce more rice. So we did a study of an AGRA-supported rice program in Burkina Faso. They have a requirement that at least a third of the participants need to be women, right? They start out, they do surveys of the urban population, they figure out what kind of rice varieties they like, then they work with seed breeders to develop those seeds. Those get shared with the farmers, and then they produce those, and those value chain, these goes to the millers. The research we did with women farmers participating in these projects is that there is no statistically significant improvement in food security or dietary diversity. It is not improving their situation. And in some cases, women actually lost land. The other interesting thing that came up in Burkina Faso is this massive proliferation of herbicides. And I've been working in Mali, in Burkina Faso since the 1980s. Herbicides were almost unheard of, right? But in Burkina Faso, they have really taken off. 92% of the women we spoke to are using herbicides, at least twice per season. And we have a multi-scalar explanation for what's going on here. So Roundup, which is the trade name for glyphosate, goes off patent in 2000. We see the rise of generic production in places like India and China. And so the price drops considerably. They negotiate entry into the West African market by targeting the country with the laxest regulations, which then gives them access to the whole market in West Africa. So that's happening internationally. But then at more of the national level, we have seen with rising gold prices a huge increase in artisanal or small-scale gold production. And so young men, young women are leaving rural areas, they're working in the gold mines, and that has created labor shortages, right? So we've got cheap herbicides, now we have rural labor shortages, and then when we get to the household level, and we think about, male heads of household, but women also farm, women also need labor to till their fields, and it's males that control the labor in the household. So women farmers in particular are labor constrained, and weeding is a very time-intensive process. And so herbicides solve that problem. It's a very rational response. The problem is there are unknown health consequences, right? So glyphosate is a suspected carcinogen, atrazine is a known hormone disruptor, and so I think we're just beginning to see these future health problems. Last country I'll mention is Botswana. Botswana is often framed as an African development miracle. It is one of the two least densely populated countries in the world, along with Mongolia, but they discover diamonds after they got independence in the late 1960s. This was very shrewdly managed, right? And so what this table is showing you is the growth rate in Botswana as compared to other African countries. And so it is very much seen as a success story. Ricardo, the 19th century economist, said you should focus on that for which you have a comparative advantage. So as they've increasingly focused on high-end ecotourism and the diamond industry, they have really pulled back from agriculture, especially crop agriculture, for which women are more involved. So women have been marginalized in this process, and today Botswana imports 90% of its food. And we did surveys in 2016, 2017, and what we found is that 56% of urban households, 66% of peri-urban households, 76% of rural households are food insecure. And this is a development success story. All right, that's all rather depressing. So I want to more quickly show you some signs of hope. So I'm going to go through the same 3 countries. So Mali also was impacted by that global food crisis in 2007, 2008. But unlike neighboring countries, there were not food riots there. And the question is why? Why didn't we have the same level of social unrest? And I think for 2 potential reasons. There was growing awareness of food sovereignty. There's the famous sort of Nyalini agreement that's there's an important meeting that happens in Mali in 2007, and so this is an African declaration about food sovereignty, but also the global price for cotton was low in this period, so we have lots of Malian farmers who say, I'm not going to grow cotton, I'm going to grow sorghum. And so when the rice price spiked, right, there was affordable sorghum on the market, and people downshifted. It's what economists call sort of downshift into an inferior good. And so I think this experience of not suffering from a global food crisis because you're producing more of your own food is important for several reasons. One, it reduces vulnerability. Second, I think it dispels this myth that there's a complementarity between cash crop and food crop production. And if you look, excuse me, somehow I went ahead here. If you look at this graph, what you see is that when cotton production goes down, sorghum production goes up, right? So these things are competing with each other, they're not facilitating each other. Also, sorghum is very amenable to intercropping. It doesn't require a lot of inputs, and it has more nutritional content than, say, another food crop like maize. And then lastly, you may be aware that there's a lot of insecurity in Mali recently, and I think it makes sense to not be engaging in long-distance trade and have a more diversified local food production system. Burkina Faso. Here what I emphasize in the book is this idea of a food environment. So I think oftentimes agronomists are very focused on the farm field, and the food environment is all the different places where you acquire food, right? So some of that may come from the farm field, right? But there also may be areas nearby in the bush or in fallow fields where you can collect food. And when we were interviewing the women who were involved with the rice project, what we found is that the vast majority of women were also foraging. And this was in particular very important in this period we know as the hungry season. This is, your crops have run out for the year, you don't have a new harvest, and this is the same time of year when a lot of these forageable products leaf out. And so this was an important source of micronutrients. So micronutrient deficiencies is another form of food insecurity. Things like baobab, which have dark leafy greens, which are an important source of iron, or Parcla bigelosa, which is also known as the African locust bean, has iron, zinc, potassium, magnesium. They ferment it and incorporate it into sauces. Last, Botswana. Almost by accident, they launch a gardening initiative, the former president does, in 2008. And women are the major gardeners in Botswana. And it's a semi-arid country, so they provide shade netting to cut down on evaporation. They have lots of water catchment ideas for collecting rainwater. They have drip irrigation. There's a focus on composting and mulching. And 4 years later, they stop this project and declare it a failure. And a student and I did research, and what we found is that the source of water really mattered. So some women were getting municipal tap water, some women were getting water from the river, Some women were getting river from boreholes, and if you had a more secure source of water, you had lower levels of food insecurity. And the graph on the bottom, while both the borehole and the tap water people, their food security improves with commercialization because you have to pay the water bill or pay off the loan for the borehole. The women who had free access to water, to the river water, the more food they kept, the better their nutrition measures were. So, last thing I want to do is zoom out and talk about the international context. And what I think it's important to realize is that production agriculture, which has come to many parts of the global south in the form of the Green Revolution, has been supported by a whole scientific research apparatus. And the UN Collaborative Group on International Agricultural Research is part of this. Now, they are beginning to explore alternatives, but the vast majority have been focused on production agriculture. And in the book, I detail a potential alternative that's more participatory. And so the graph on the right is the Committee on World Food Security. It's based in Rome. It coordinates policy between the FAO, the WFP, and IFAD, which is the International Fund for Agricultural Development. It has different member states are represented. They underwent an important set of reform in 2009, and now we not only have member states that are represented, but there are representatives of civil society and the business community. They have a seat at the table. Also in 2009, they create the UN High-Level Panel of Experts for Food Security and Nutrition, what some people refer to as the IPCC for food. So this deliberative body, the Committee on World Food Security, can commission studies from the high-level panel of experts. Those studies get debated, they get turned into policy recommendations, and they also carry discursive weight within the UN system. So lo and behold, 2019, the Committee on World Food Security asked for a report on agroecology. And this gets debated, the report. We now have voluntary guidelines. And I think almost more important is the fact that now agroecology is talked about as a viable alternative within the UN system in a way that it was not talked about before. Now, this did not go unnoticed. There were certain parties who were unhappy. The 2021 UN Food Systems Summit happened in New York, and there was an attempt to sideline the CFS, to sideline the high-level panel of experts for food security and nutrition, to create an alternative body. But what was behind that were the interests of production agriculture. And civil society played a huge role at this moment by pushing back. They boycotted the summit, and they were not successful in creating this alternative organization. So to conclude, in the last part of the book, I talk about, it's sort of, what's a recipe for a revolution? How are we going to get change? And so we start out with the status quo, which is production agriculture. I think it's useful if you have a crisis, right? If you have high food prices, people begin to question, does this system make sense? Then if you have a trenchant critique of the existing system, if you have viable alternatives like agroecology, then I think it's very important that you have a social movement that is pushing for those alternatives. And lastly, I do think it's useful to have allies within government, within important institutions, and then you can potentially get change. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Prof, for that presentation. Please don't go. Just take a seat here because we'll be, Prof, please sit because we'll be having a conversation with you right away. But if you need something to pick, you can do so. Good morning. Are we okay? Is it clear what he's proposing? By show of hands, is it clear? I see a few hands that are not raised, so we will seek to address that. You'll talk to us and tell us what the challenges are that you're witnessing. But I think it's an important occasion. First of all, can you clap for Prof for that presentation? Thank you very much for that. I want now to introduce our discussants for the day. They're not necessarily the only ones that are going to share with us the ideas that they have. We have several people that you'll be adding the questions. And just to remind those that are joining us online, we'll be asking you to make your interventions or interjections. Whenever you do, please liaise with the technical team. We'll be sure to hear or read your questions. But at the same time, allow me to introduce the following. When I introduce you, please come on board. I see Prof has chosen that's fine. Dr. Gloria Otieno, please come. She works in the agroecology, agrobiodiversity, and climate resilience area and brings cutting edge and experience and scientific evidence on resilient farming systems. Let me also invite Dr. David Kabanda, whose leadership in advancing food sovereignty and the right to food challenges us to think about agriculture, not only as an economic activity, but also as a matter of governance, justice, and public policy. And I think some of those illustrations that Prof has given will also be guiding us in this discussion. Let me also invite Mrs. Mary Wehenya, whose practical experience in agroecological farming, soil health, and biological alternatives will be helping us to ground the conversation today. She'll be giving us some of the insights of what she's been able to experience. And also to invite Honorable Thor Gatpa Gideon, who sits in IALA, East African Legislative Assembly. He chairs the Committee on Agriculture, Tourism, and Natural Resources, like I said, at IALA. Thank you all, and I think you'll sit next to Prof. Let's give them a hand. Please sit over there next to Prof, if you don't mind. All right, so let's get started. And just remind you that we want to have a blended conversation in a situation that you'll have an opportunity to raise your questions as soon as you feel you want to add your contribution. But Prof, I know you mentioned something about your positioning and why we are here. But let's just explore that a little further, if you can get your microphone there, on why we should listen to you, given your experience, of course, as a scholar and where you're coming from, at a time that we are talking about decolonization and the situation, the history of the African countries, the East African countries, the systems that we use in our agricultural sectors and many other sectors. Why should we listen to you?
This is an excellent question, and I'm so glad you asked this. My short answer is, we're all in this together. And whether I like it or not, I am implicated in this problem. And so I referred to political ecology at the beginning of my talk, this multi-scalar perspective. You can't think about farmers in isolation, how they are influenced by national policies, regional trading relationships, the programs of international institutions. And another important aspect of political ecology is discourse, the dominant ideas, and how those are shaped by powerful interests. And so I think in many cases, dominant ideas about what's progress, what's agricultural development, as you rightly note, come out of the West, right? And so I think if we are going to begin, and those ideas influence practice on the ground, right? And when I was an undergraduate, I remember I was very skeptical of theory. I just wanted to go out and work and do stuff. But what I've gradually come to understand is that none of us just act in the world. We are influenced by ideas, paradigms. And so if we're going to change how we're acting in the world, we need to change those paradigms. And I think we need to think about actors across multiple scales, right? Farmers in East Africa, government officials at the level of different nations, but also scientists in all different parts of the world. And the reality, for better or for worse, is that you have many ministers of agriculture that were trained in the West, right? And so they have been intellectually colonized. And so their dominant paradigm has been influenced by Western institutions. And so, don't just listen to me, but I would like you to at least acknowledge that we are all somehow implicated, and we're going to change this system if we work across different scales rather than, working in our own separate spaces.
Thank you, Prof. And it's important to highlight that about the training of ministers in agriculture particularly. But then, if you look at even the East African countries, we've had a series of elections, 2025 in Tanzania, 2026 in Uganda, Kenya in 2027. If you look at every political system, you'll find the manifestos are carrying something about agriculture and food security. And many of them are talking about how we're going to subsidize some of the inputs, how we're going to make sure that this becomes one of the key sources of income for the people in the population, but also governments. So as we decolonize, what exactly do you want us to change?
So it's interesting that you bring up political campaigns. And I think politicians draw on conventional ideas about what constitutes progress, what constitutes the modernization of agriculture. And I think in many people's minds, they think about it involves tractors, it involves mechanization, it involves chemicals, right? It's about producing more in the short term. But that is only one kind of technology. I also think there is sort of soft technology, which is know-how, and agroecology, for me, is soft technology. If you can learn to leverage ecological relationships to produce more healthy food sustainably, that's another type of technology. But politicians don't go there. Maybe it's because they're not familiar with agroecology or they don't think the public can understand it. But I think we need change across multiple scales, and I think we need to think about technology in a different way than we have historically.
Right. We'll revisit that point as we continue the conversation. But Dr. Gloria, talk to us about what you think about the findings or what Professor is advocating here. How much of that we're already using in our farming communities and in our countries?
Yes, thank you very much for this invitation and to you for asking that very important question. I read the book with a lot of interest, actually, a lot of interest, and quite a number of things that the professor raises in that book are actually true. I have worked in the sector and in the area of agroecology and seed systems for the past 14 years. And the things he talks about are real, because one of the issues where we have failed as African states is to, and as researchers actually, is to think that there is a one size fits all to agriculture. And that if the Green Revolution happened in Europe, it can also happen in Africa and elsewhere. But the Green Revolution failed terribly in Africa. And the reason why the Green Revolution failed in Africa was because our agricultural systems are quite different. We are moving from agricultural systems that are dominated by smallholder farmers. Smallholder farmers practice whatever they can on their farms for, first of all, for subsistence, which means they would like to engage in production of a number of crops that supply food through the entire season. But we came and told them that, look, we are producing for yield and we are pursuing productivity. And we asked them that clear your farms and start doing monoculture. And then when the crop fails due to climate shocks or due to pests and diseases or due to other shocks, then they're stuck and they don't have any food on their farms. And then came the structural adjustment programs that dismantled everything. We used to have extension services that were dismantled with structural adjustment programs. We used to have support for farmers, and there was a wide range of diversity of crops. And then all those disappeared throughout the process of colonization of agriculture. Unfortunately, even after we received independence, the colonization still continued, because most of our researchers are taught that when you breed, you are breeding for high yields and productivity. But my experience with farmers shows that farmers need yield stability and not high yields. And farmers need a diversity of food on their farms, so that if one crop fails, then another one can help them meet their food security demands. And in the process, we also dealt with our plates, brutally narrowed our diversity of food on our plates. And one thing is because now we are relying mostly on only 12 crops to produce 75% of our dietary needs. And those 12 crops are the likes of maize, wheat, rice, few crops. And yet we have 5,000 plant species that are edible. We are forgetting that we have neglected and underutilized crops and opportunity crops, which can also serve as a basis for food security. We used to consume a lot of finger millet when I was growing up, a lot of sorghum when I was growing up. All that disappeared. Now my children complain when I cook finger millet ugali because they are used to maize. So this change doesn't have to start only from the farm, it should also start from the plate. We must decolonize our plate and then think of decolonizing the agricultural system so that our taste buds can go back to our indigenous food crops and the opportunity crops that we are ignoring. Now, I want to also talk about shocks, because this is something that I have seen throughout my work. I want to say that every crisis travels through imported inputs. If you look at the 2008 and 9 global food price crisis, there was a shock. And when the shock led to increased food prices, and then what happened? We had increased fertilizer prices, increased seed costs, and so food became very expensive. Quickly moving to COVID, there was a shock on the supply chain disruptions. People could not get fertilizers delivered. People could not get seeds. Why? Because we are relying on commercial seed systems, and we are forgetting that our own seed systems that allow farmers to exchange, share, and save saved seed and use it on their farms could also help support in times of crisis and shocks. When Russia invaded Ukraine in 2012, what happened? There was a crisis on wheat because we are over-relying also on imports of wheat. Why must we import huge amounts of wheat when we can produce finger millet and sorghum and sweet potatoes and yams and pumpkins and have an agroecologically intensive farm that supplies all manner of foods that can be accessed throughout the entire season? Why must we farm only one crop and then we wait the whole season and then the crop fails for some reason, maybe because there is a drought, and then we start going to the government for food subsidies?
That's interesting. And I take note that you said that we have close to 5,000 food crops that we can actually source from. I don't know, the people that didn't lift their hands, I don't know how many of you can list for us the sources of starch that you know at the moment. Anyone who has a microphone there who can help us talk about that? Okay, we'll try to get a microphone back there. But talk to us about the seed sovereignty, David. The seed sovereignty, because she's talking about a few things there about seed sharing. She's also speaking about inputs and the supply shocks that we've had to suffer. How does that space look like for these East African countries on food sovereignty?
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Professor. That was wonderful. Like my sister Gloria, I love your book. I have read it cover to cover. In the night, I had to sleep with my laptop reading your book again. So the conversation is getting interesting, and particularly because we got lost somewhere. and it is a cardinal law that when you get lost, don't continue moving. It is important that you trace back at what point did you get lost. Now, when we are talking about decolonization, and Dr. Harun, I saw the conversation that was on social media when some people saw this public lecture, and some people are like, we are not supposed to be talking about decolonization, we are supposed to be talking about more exports, and you clearly see that decolonization is continuing. And when we were colonized in the economic infrastructure, including agriculture, that did not only stop at that level, it also came to the legal policy and also research and intellectual development. I think this is what you've even referred to from our intellectual, pool is being influenced from elsewhere. Now, when it comes to food sovereignty, we sometimes even hate or resist or reject what is supposed to be supporting our health systems. For example, many of the foods that my sister is talking about, when you go to the international global scale, they are called orphaned foods. That disturbs me a lot. If you are talking about cocoa yam, if you are talking about our indigenous yam, at the global literature, they call it orphaned foods. And then who named it orphaned? Why are we calling it orphaned foods? Because the thing is they want now to promote rice, wheat, and that's the only thing that you should find. Now, when we talk about food sovereignty, it must be also understood in the context of political sovereignty. And you don't have a sovereignty in the technical meaning of the word without you having food sovereignty. And we need to go back to the default setting of where did we get lost from? And if you allow me, I think we need now to embrace a human rights-based approach if we want to get decolonized, if we want to see our agriculture in Africa getting decolonized. Why? Because at the base of a human rights-based approach is the understanding of power relations. Since morning, you realize that the kind of conversation we have has a lot to do with power. And unequal power relations push many people into poverty, it pushes people into human rights violations, and it keeps them in the cycle of unending poverty. Unequal power relations. This is why Professor is talking about gender, is talking about inclusivity. The moment we do not bring up these, actually we need to unpack and understand what is the problem. Now, a human rights-based approach will quickly tell you that you need rule of law. The moment we talk about food sovereignty, we are talking about who we are. We need to stand up and go back and unpack who we are. And it is very important that these lectures are happening. Dear director, dear Daktari, we need to have not only this. We need to have these lectures in all of Africa. Each country must have a dose of these genuine, intentional conversations. Let us go back and find out who controls us. Power. Because some of these companies have a lot of money, and because of the structural adjustment programs that you've talked about, then they brought in neoliberalism, and we are talking about capitalism, and we are talking about free commercial speech, and the moment we go into that conversation, we lose it completely because you are dealing with a very powerful, dominant corporate structure that you have not studied their intentions. They bring you green revolution and everything. You don't know how it started, and it's really objective. So by the time you embrace it, you wake up and you've lost almost everything. Now, we need to go back and question. Imagine with me, colleagues, some of us, even in this room, were victims of COVID-19. The only people who survived the COVID, whether they were victims as patients or not, are those people who had real food. If you want to argue with me, scientists can prove you wrong. The people who had underlying health problems and people who could not, the global food system failed completely. It was those markets, it was those farmers, it was those people who understood having food sovereignty that could feed their people. And I know I'll come back to this, but we need to understand that food sovereignty requires that we understand, she called it taste buds, but food is also culture. Seriously, what people eat in some continents is not what people eat everywhere. So it cannot be a one size fit all. So we need, you see, in Africa, I think it's the only continent where you find that some countries do not even have a food atlas. So they actually do not know. Some of the policymakers and you may find that they don't know exactly. You see, Sister Gloria is talking about 5,000 species where you can get food. But if you did research in Africa, many of us, this is not documented. So day in, day out, many are getting extinct under our nose. And this is what is supposed to continue our posterity, to continue our legacies, but we are losing it. So we need to make sure that law, where I started from is, where did we lose it from? We need to go back to the cardinal principle of rule of law. This is why some of us as lawyers are coming on board. For the policymakers to understand that, you see, food and agriculture sector must also be governed in a proper, effective legal policy infrastructure, and we can hold leaders accountable. If leaders go at the continental level and make a declaration that 10% of their budgets will be going to agriculture, we need to hold them accountable. Where is this money? And what did it do? Thank you so much.
Okay, all right. You're getting into some interesting insights that you'll deal with shortly from now. But also, if there are any reactions from the floor, I'll be glad to take them. Before we do so, Mary, help us here, because you are a practitioner. How does agroecology manifest itself? Because even before we talk about how can we adopt it as the guiding principle, say, in an economy, how is it manifesting in the farming communities?
Thank you very much for having me. It's such a privilege. I'm nodding my head as I listen to all of you speak, because these are not concepts. These are my realities every day. As someone who farms for a livelihood and works alongside other farms trying to help them transition to an agroecological way of farming, I am rightfully here and I have a lot to share, if only you'll give me time. I'll try to be brief though. How does it show itself? First of all, I want to say that I have come to define the transformation as restoring function, because something is broken. The system that is at hand is not working, and that's usually the starting point. I will summarize a transformation in 3 ways. That's how my thoughts have collected themselves this morning. The first way is we've said it here, we need to rethink how we are looking at a farm, the ecosystem around the farm. We have such a disjointed way of farming. When there are pests, we buy a spray. When there is a plumbing issue, we call irrigation experts. When there is disease pressure, yet another person. They are consultants in these farms from foreign countries coming in and giving us advice. We have been reduced to consumer of solutions, none of which we are producing ourselves as farmers. Transformation for me starts with looking at what is the thing that is causing the real problem. If you've ever heard me speak before, I say I farm the soil and not crops. I farm my soil and my soil grows my crops. This change of heart is the heart of agroecology, in my opinion. When we change our focus, we begin to see how a balanced ecosystem works for us. Let me give you an example. I have recently moved to a new farming location. The soil needs to be regenerated. This is the third time I've done it personally. I've become a little more confident in getting it done. One of the crops I introduced was strawberries. One, because my son loves them, and I could not keep up with his demand. So I decided to learn the crop and I grow it. When the flowers started to come on the strawberries, we were amazed. My farm was full of bees, and they were doing exactly what we hoped they would do. They would pollinate, each flower at a time. The fruit set that came was amazing. I was like, now somebody needs to come and see, this is ecosystem working for us. And then another part of nature showed up. As soon as the fruits began to ripen, guess who showed up? Birds. They were eating this fruit before I could harvest. And I said, I farm for a livelihood. I need to sell this fruit. So stay with me, you'll see where this story is going. We worried. I farm with my husband, and we worried. We're like, what will we do? At the time, we only had enough money to cover one section with a bird net. The other section just had to stay open. Unexpectedly, as the farm continued to develop, we are a market garden, growing over 40 crops, the least aiming to grow over 100 crops in a year or so. The ecosystem began to change. We realized the birds were no longer eating our strawberries. It didn't make sense. We had to ask, what's happened? I didn't change how I farm. I didn't change anything, but yes, something had changed. You see, I had sweet corn, peas, broccoli, cauliflower. I had numerous crops that these birds could eat. So they were touching one strawberry. It didn't affect my system. The ecosystem had balanced. It changes everything, guys. Our lead harvester went through the same experience. When we first began, I would find his lips red. I mean, he's harvesting the strawberries and eating almost as much as he's harvesting. But as diversity has begun to fill our farm, there is so much to eat. If you ever visit me, there'll be sugarcane and gooseberries, and you will not be hungry visiting an agroecological farm. And that's a very important note. We need to transform how we view farming. We cannot farm cotton on its own. We need to be a diverse farm. Fill our stomachs and the ones around us. Another critical aspect has been, I have found very disempowered farmers. Farmers who are not able to think of any solutions on their own. Farmers who are unable to see fertility on their land. We have been fed kind of the idea that somebody else must think on our behalf. So one of the ways I'm beginning to see transformation as I work in these farms is as you begin to tell people, this comfrey, if you ferment it, this is all the potassium you need in your crop. As they begin to open their eyes, the confidence builds and they become equal players on the farm, creating their own solutions. So we're starting to see independence. We're starting to see agency. That's what transformation looks like. The other thing is, I am disputing the long debate that agroecological farms cannot produce yield. This has not been my experience. Even as a new farmer, I always met the yield expectations, but I go even further. I meet the quality expectations, I meet the taste expectations, and I meet the shelf life expectations. If you've ever eaten food from an organic farmer, you will realize the food is very tasty. So we go far beyond the yield expectation. That's one narrow way of looking at it. So we've seen transformation this way. I walk into farms and I demonstrate that I can grow exactly what you're growing without any synthetic fertilizer or pesticide, and that is the entry point. Once we have proven that that is possible, then I begin to ask you to consider changing your model. I begin to ask you to consider diversity as a way in solving your problems.
Wow.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Do you grow maize?
I grow sweet corn because that is the preference of my son. And if you've ever grown sweet corn and maize cross-pollinate and dilute the sugar in the sweet corn. So my choice, I have chosen to grow sweet corn.
And you're not using synthetic fertilizer?
Absolutely none. You will never find a pesticide or a chemical in my farm.
Okay. Interesting lessons that we learn. And by the way, until recently, I didn't know that gooseberries can actually be farmed. I thought they are found in bushes. But I'm told that we'll have some online questions coming in. But before we do so, Honorable Gideon, talk to us about what you think at the East African level is doable, whether it's through legislation or convincing governments to adopt some of these proposals that would adopt more agroecology in farms, more sovereignty in how we farm?
Thank you very much, and I can't say more for the Henrik Ball Foundation and all the partners who have been really with us in this journey. Let me, first of all, put one thing very, very clear, that we are in agreement as a region with the ideas of Professor William, in the sense that in his viewpoints, he's saying that the hunger in Africa is not a production problem. Rather, access to food, political, or even the type of political economy that we have. And surely framing the question of hunger in Africa that way, and that it has to be addressed through sufficient food production, is a fundamental misdiagnosis of the real African problem. So we are together with you in these views. And then coming to the regional architecture in terms of approach, we currently have very fragmented approach that you find a partner state, let's say Kenya, a county like Muranga has an agroecology law. There's a national strategy, but not a law. Of course, a strategy you cannot enforce. It does not have mechanisms which are universally enforceable. So and then you go to other countries that way, and then you will see a country may decide to reduce on highly hazardous pesticides. And the notion of reducing this is not because they have accepted to go ecological, but it is because they are losing external market. Because the same people that they are exporting these crops to, they don't want this produce because they have been produced using banned agrochemical inputs. So now we have come to the region, and we think East African community is best positioned to harmonize these fragmented approaches. And then we are not looking only into policy. A policy is good, but it is like an agreement. It does not have enforcement measures that can be able to bind the region. So we are looking at a legal framework, a regional legislation, and of course, in the East African community, our laws take precedence over the national laws, except the national constitution. So we are taking it that way so that we create a uniform enforcement across border. And these are the things which are happening. In East African community, there's a legislative part of it, and there is executive, which is led by the Secretariat, and there's also the judicial arm of the East African. It's a complete supranational government. But it lacks certain powers to be ceded to it by the sovereign states. And that's why we are working toward political confederation. Maybe the partner state will be able to cede some powers so that East African community also can be able to enforce. For now, enforcement is done by partner states themselves. So here is what we are doing. We have the Secretariat, which is working with the bureaucrats in partner states and experts in the partner states. So their views are drawn from the treaty establishing the East African Community. The treaty is actually looking at hunger as a production problem. It is talking about food sufficiency, food security. Those are the questions that are being solved through conventional agriculture, not ecological agriculture. Export-oriented production, where now the poorest of the poor are left without getting any access to this food. So malnutrition rises, and then the hunger continues to persist. That is one understanding from the executive standpoint. Also, they are arguing that agroecology is not an approach, it is a practice. So since it is a practice, it cannot be legislated alone. Then we have not yet come to our legislative standing. So, and they focus on also seed and plant variety. And this is where now scientists across the region are competing. The whole thing is to disseminate how many Kenyan scientists have produced GMO cassava and then be able to feed East Africans. It is not about what type of food that we are going to consume. So science and technology are leading in the approach of the East African community. And then it is thought that they can be able to also address the issues of climate change and climate adaptation. That is the executive viewpoint. Now let's come to legislative standing. I will not dwell in legislative pathway, nor I will dwell in parameters that are contained in regional legislation. But I would like to take us to how we are viewing it. What do we want to achieve? We know now that our problem is not mass production of food. It is something else. So we have to change the approach, and that is to go ecological or agroecological farming. Now, how do we negotiate, and how are we convincing the region? Is that number one, is that tinkering to the current food system is not an option. It is going to relegate many farmers from the farming practice. And then we shall be left with a few who are feeding external market. That is a recipe not only for further colonization, but also for terrible hunger in our region. So that is not fair for humanity. So we are saying science and technology are not bad, but they must be used respectably to respect humanity. They are not bad, they are good friends. It is only application that we differ with the people. So, and we are also saying, we are not, because the region do not want to hear three words. One, transformational. They are saying we are just transforming everything back to the traditional way of doing things. That can't be transformation. So transformation for them is progressive. It must bring new things. That's one. They don't want mainstreaming. If we say we want to mainstream agroecology, they also do not want to hear of the word mainstreaming, because they are saying all these are fighting conventional agriculture. We shall be scaling down in terms of food production. And then the third one is what I've talked about, mainstreaming, transformational. And then the real issue is about agroecological transition. Where are we going to? So those three things are points of discussion at the regional level. But here we are saying we are not fighting the conventional agriculture, but we want to create a choice. Because a middle age population in East Africa, all of them have declined from feeding from fast food. They are looking for kienyeji. I think you understand the local thing they call kienyeji. We are going to give choice for those who want to eat healthy food, which is kienyeji, or those who want to eat faster food. Faster food now is eaten by the young age, which are going to get employment in the towns and what they need fast food to rush for their jobs. But the senior age is totally retired to eat only kienyeji. The middle age is also going back to kienyeji. So if you kill this one, agroecological farming, where will this population eat? There must be a choice for you to have something to eat, which is good for you, and you must have also a choice to eat something that you know is dangerous. So these are the arguments that we are doing. We are also saying that, agroecologically produced food is attracting very premium prices in the market. They are very expensive. So we are saying, why don't we maximize this? We produce it, because you are arguing that you cannot scale. When we also say it is scalable. You can produce it in large scale, but because they are saying it is labor intensive, what it cannot be scaled up, we are saying it can be scaled, produce this one and supply the market. You get premium prices. Secondly, we in East Africa, we are leading in tourist attraction. What is it that we are offering? You cannot offer tourists what they have. Offer them what you have. And what we have, our African culinary, is informed by our food ingredient that we produce locally. So for us to attract tourists, they have to eat our own food, made in our own way. That is bringing us to our food sovereignty. And for us, we are saying now, we are not going to have a broader objective in terms of our agroecology bill, the bill which is now advancing in the region. We are aiming to protect agroecology farmers, and we are aiming to promote agroecology. Now, there will be, if we do that, there will be resultant benefits. The resultant benefits will be climate resilient farming, and then soil health, sustainable livelihood, environmental preservation. We will have biodiversity survival and vibrant rurality. There, you have already intellectually and practically decolonized yourself, because that is the way for us to go. Now, there are questions that I want to share with the professor, because we are interacting with his ideas. There's something that I think is coming clear, is like a radical transformation. Radical transformation versus incremental change. The region is fearful of radical transformation. For us, we know that is where we are going, but we are really navigating very, very, very carefully because it can jeopardize all efforts that we are doing. Incremental change is not also the answer, but these are things that we need to leave for discussion, that we have to really make sure that we refine them. And we must find an approach that is acceptable. We know it will require time for us to convince, but that is one thing that we need. Again, you mentioned that agronomy is apolitical. Isn't it apolitical? It is a political one. Since it is a political one, and we are of course, this economy we are having now is tropical agronomy, and we are feeding industrialized societies. But now, since it is apolitical, we have sometimes, I would call this popular political apathy. Political apathy brings on board unpopular governments. Unpopular governments come up with their own agendas because they have to seek support from outside. And also, they have to come with the subsidies. They have to come with many issues of fertilizers, pesticides, which are highly hazardous to make sure that they convince the population, because population did not vote for them, but they must find a way to be in power. So this unpopular political apathy brings unpopular governments. Unpopular governments, when it comes to institutional reforms, like we are talking about, when we are introducing institutional reforms, these reforms are either going to be driven by unpopular governments that are not representing the will of the people, or they are going, if they have to engage the population will be very slow in trying to get messaging from the government that they think they have not brought to power. Okay. So these are discussions that we are also getting. And then for me to wind up is that there are questions which we have been dealing with in our journey to agroecology law. Number one is regional consensus in policies and law.
Honorable Gideon,
yes.
Can you pause for at that moment? You'll get another chance for you to
conclude on that. Thank you.
Because also we need to reflect on what the audiences are saying. I'll get back to the room, but first I want us to hear from those that are joining us online. The first one is Akinya Wara. If you can hear me, give us your question or contribution.
But I'm wondering, should we also be asking the question on who owns the memory when it comes to our African food systems? Because we're currently living in a day and time where traceability is important. So if at all you are fronting products that have been produced agroecologically, or you are taking organic products into the market, one of the key things that we look at is traceability. And are we able to answer the questions and define every single thing that happened while you were producing that particular product? So when you look at things like identity, the 5,000 species and orphan foods that you're talking about, all of these things ties into what is visible that is being produced by African agriculture in the global markets, versus also where are our farmers and everybody else getting information from. So when it comes to whatever it is that we use as reference, the memory that feeds whatever data, whatever decisions it is that we make when it comes to policy, as far as decolonizing agriculture is concerned, my question is, do we believe that provenance also carries as much weight as everything else that we've had a conversation on? Thank you.
All right. I wish you could say who you want to respond to your question. Now I hear myself. Anyway, Frederick Odera is our next on the line. Please raise your question and tell us who you're directing your question to. Frederick, are you there?
Yes, all of you. Yeah, this is Frederick Otieno. I'm representing Apiculture Platform of Kenya, and I'm very much happy about this conversation. Mine is very short, and I'm very much happy that there's one panelist who just talked about the presence of the bees and also other pollinators in the farm. And you know, presence of bees and other pollinators, that is a sign of healthy environment. Now, my question, I know that we have started advocating for biopesticides. Are we sure that they are organic? Now that other companies, chemical companies have already started working on sure that these biopesticides are real or organic? That question can go to anyone who can respond to it. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you so much, Frederick. Peter Mokaya, if you're there, please this time don't say anyone, just say who you want to address your question.
Unfortunately, I joined late, so I didn't get some of the discussions.
No, it's okay, Frederick. I'm talking to Peter Mokaya. Thank you, Fred. Peter Mokaya, if you can hear me, your question or contribution. I think we'll get back to Peter later. Is there someone who can take the two questions? Are you okay now? Okay, go right ahead.
I don't know whether I really can remember the name of the lady who asked. Akinyi, yes. Okay, thank you, Akinyi. She asked the question that what policies and laws are we looking in decolonizing agriculture in Africa? Yes, like I mentioned earlier, we need to tighten down the approach into harmonized one, and you cannot do that without law, because laws are social contracts between the citizens and the governments they brought to power. So now, if we have to decolonize agriculture, we have to decolonize first our laws. We enact laws that reflect what we think currently. We don't engage with laws which are providing for external oriented production in terms of agriculture. So the laws we are looking at in the East African region, we are looking at the regional law that will compel every state to harmonize their law with that law. And we are saying that is the best approach, because if we do it state by state, it may take time. One state may take a step ahead, the other one will still be lagging behind. But when we introduce a regional law, like I mentioned earlier, I will not talk about the parameters of the law, but also not on the step-by-step process, which is a legislative pathway. But a regional law has got a regional enforcement mechanism with all the regulations. So you are compelled to change the law in your own partner state to reflect the provision of the regional law, or you apply the regional law direct and repeal your national law. So in terms of policies are short-term measures, because like you have a protocol. A protocol can be signed by all the partner states, let's say for the East African community, but for them to be operationalized, you need a law to operationalize that protocol. So here, a protocol can be done as a short-term measure. Let's say, for example, we are not importing to East African community any pesticide that has been banned by all conventions. So it should not be exported to East Africa, or East Africa should not import that. That can be, in a short term, you can have a protocol in the region, or you have a national government, parliament resolution for a particular state to ban that. So for us, we need to consider national laws that repeals the provision of the current laws that promote this outward production. That is what I can tell you. Thank you.
Okay, all right. Go ahead. I'll get to you.
May I add something regarding the recent developments about the process of decolonizing agriculture? We have been seriously looking at our seed laws as three East African regional countries. And our seed laws have been so bad to the extent some countries have criminalized farmers from sharing seed and so on and so forth. So what we have done and this is at the African Union level with the African Seed and Biotechnology Platform. We have actually developed a framework on farmer-managed seed systems that looks at issues to do with conservation, promoting community seed banking, promoting issues of seed sovereignty, farmers' rights to exchange and save seed through Article 9 of the International Treaty for food and agriculture, which we are all party to at the regional level. So that framework for policy and strategy will actually be launched in October at the inaugural African Union Seed Summit. Giving that kind of law at the African Union level will then allow countries now to start taking measures towards decolonization of our seed systems. Remember, this is not only a seed system issue. We also have issues of pesticide laws and regulations that he has talked about. And I wanted us also to critically think about, this has been going on in my mind for a long time. Another measure of food security is actually food safety, because you can have food available, it is accessible, there is stability of supply of that food, but that food is not safe because it is riddled with all manner of banned pesticides. So if we cannot assure food safety to our citizens, we cannot claim to be food secure. So that is one angle that I would really like us to embrace further, that food safety can be also in our regulations. And I think Kenya is currently debating so much on issues of food safety, and that is one area where we are also developing some regulations and some policies. Aside from that, there is also the matter of food systems transformation. Again, there is a lot of discussion at continental level to start, and this is at the African Union level, to start recognizing African crops, African orphaned crops, as key to transformation of food systems, bringing them back to the table. Because when you create demand for those African crops, then you are not only transforming the diets of the people and having more healthier Africans, but you are also transforming the entire agricultural landscape of the continent. Thank you.
Oh, all right. I don't know what you'd say about some of those orphan crops at a time that we are getting genetically modified crops, but we'll get to that. Before you go, let's hear from Mary. There was a question there. Sorry, there was a question there about traceability of food and who owns the memory. Do you want to respond to that as you
I
make
want
your
to
statement?
respond to Frederick's, but I can respond to that. I was once an export farmer, and as an export farmer, you really have to record keep. You track that one seed that was planted, and you have records of everything that was done to that one seed until the point of harvest. I have continued with the same mindset even as a local farmer. So traceability is there. There's a big knowledge gap that needs to be fed, let me put it that way. Even as I listen to our conversations, we're not fighting conventional. We're just acknowledging that the system is vulnerable, that it is not profitable. And even if it's profitable in one season, it is unsustainable because they can't get the same yield ever again. The other thing we're acknowledging is that we are wary when we see the same companies that sell us the harsh pesticides come and sell us organic pesticides. We are using the same mindset. We are simplifying ecosystems and therefore concentrating the problems. I'm seeing organic pesticides still being written for aphids, a different one, for thrips. That's the same thinking that we were holding in conventional farming. This is not what agroecology is, and this is why I advocate for less dependency on any bought inputs. We hold a lot of knowledge. A lot of the knowledge I've gained in the last 6 years is not mine. It's from conversations with the people who farm around me, who have given me such wisdom on what works. It is from scoring the internet. I mean, a degree gives you the ability to read. I read widely. I read Mosley's documents on other countries, but I'll read widely. What can I get from Europe, India, Asia? What can I get from my grandmother in Embu, who farmed tea for years and years? What have I seen? We have to allow ourselves to use the knowledge that we have to create solutions for ourselves. This is the point I'm saying. I am wary of those products. I am not speaking against them, but I'm saying we can do it ourselves. Let us reduce our dependency on bought fertility or bought pesticides.
You know, that's fascinating because he spoke about one key word that is not appreciated about mainstreaming. So let Prof go, and then we can hear from David here.
I just want to build on what Mary said in relation to the question about organic pesticides. And Gideon talked about incremental change versus radical change. And I think organic pesticides, that idea, it's incremental change. We're going to replace one kind of pesticide with another. And agroecologists, and I think Mary gave this beautiful example with the strawberries, she didn't try to solve the bird problem by, using some chemical. It was through diversity. And so diversity, intercropping, agroforestry shows us that you can minimize these problems without having to use external inputs. And I just, historically, if we take my own country, the United States, if we go World War II to the present, the amount of chemicals we are using has increased 1,000-fold, yet the crop loss has remained the same because of pesticide resistance. So we're using, we're on this treadmill, more and more and more chemicals, but we're not really reducing crop loss. And so we need, I would argue, a radical paradigm shift, thinking about using diversity to manage this problem rather than, something you buy.
Okay. All right. I wonder how you deal with the baboons and monkeys without clearing the forest. David?
Thank you so much. The conversation is very interesting. Now, on the issue of traceability, identity, and information, you realize that this is a low-focused component. The moment someone talks about traceability, identity, then the next thing in line is intellectual property. But when you do deep analysis of what is happening or what is available in Africa, part of what we lost most is the understanding of intellectual property. And I think it comes from who we are, because as Africans, we thrive on Ubuntu. You are because I am, we are because you are. So for a very long time, the dominant powers have taken advantage of that. Anytime they come, and they come with very dangerous laws, including criminalizing communities and grow those vegetables. So one of it is the farmers themselves showing us what is changing when they change it to agroecology. And what we encourage them is not to have to radically transit. Start, maybe if you have 5 acres, can you start with an acre, and then you see how things work out. Then definitely you will see, for me, I will start with the farmers. Each farmer that is engaged, let there be a deliberate monitoring and evaluation and publication of those results. Even including us as civil society, to show that it works. Because now we have already catered for, or will have catered for, the policy or strategies, and we are working day and night with Honorable Gideon to make sure that in East Africa, at least there is a law enforceable, and that will happen. Now, when it comes to way forward, I'll leave these other questions to my colleagues. For me, I'll go back, because I'm a lawyer and I'm a human rights practitioner. There needs to be participation as a stand-alone principle, because we know that exclusion, many people have been excluded. And you realize that in many of African parliaments, it is either French or English that is used to even come up with laws and policies. And then you wonder whether we are representing the people properly. those people or farmers or ordinary people like me, let me also be, you know, we understand there is a lot of indigenous knowledge that has not been documented, and it keeps evolving, and we are not tapping into it. So we really need to engage and promote participation. Kenya tries in the region to look at participation, even if you look at the judgments that come from courts on the concept of participation, the judges are giving it expansive interpretation other than other countries. So we need to embrace it. I'm not saying that in Kenya everything is okay, but at least when you read the jurisprudence on participation, then accountability, we cannot leave it out. We need to hold our leaders accountable. And when we hold them accountable, it's not that it is us against them. We are all into this together. We go to the same markets. You find that our leaders are also suffering with non-communicable diseases that are dietary related. Taking our money to hospital tourism in other countries like India and everywhere. It starts with them. They have children with obesity, overweight, themselves having too many dietary-related non-communicable diseases that come from high hazardous pesticides and a failing food system. So we need to communicate this clearly to them, that working towards transforming into a sustainable food system, particularly agroecology, does not benefit us, it benefits all of us. And then lastly is empowerment, because empowerment is very important. For a long time when Green Revolution started in Africa, there has been intentional misleading from the global transnational corporations, using radio, using television, misleading the public. They start with government. They mislead the government that, you know, if you go conventional agriculture, you'll get everything that you need. Eventually, the government allow them, and then they mislead. So there is a lot of mindset twisting with many communities. So there is need to have clear empowerment of communities and researchers themselves to decolonize the intellectual space, because it is also colonized. And lastly, rule of law. If we have come up with a policy or a law, we must make sure that it is enforced, and it should not only be lawyers, but as we grow the movement, because the movement is growing, nobody should lie to you. The movement is growing. The problem is clear. We are suffering, we are dying. Many families are just a step away into poverty because one family member who gets a non-communicable disease. I don't know what is happening in other places. Back home, we even have car drive, campaigns. If someone has cancer, you need, and before you know it, the entire family property has been sold because someone has developed cancer, and it is coming from food largely. So if we can address that and enforce the laws and hold ourselves accountable, farmers must be accountable, leaders must be accountable, civil society must be accountable. This is not just a project. It's not project, but a movement. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Maybe I would like to speak about some misconceptions around agroecology. I think one of the biggest misconceptions has already been mentioned here. One of the biggest misconceptions is that agroecology is not profitable. And this is really ideally wrong, because we have looked at research at the farm level, where we have farmers doing conventional agriculture vis-a-vis farmers that are practicing agroecology. If you look at the amount of inputs they have to use on their farms, the conventional practitioners, they have a lot of expenditure. But in terms of agroecology, you have minimum tillage, you don't spend money on tractor, you have minimum use of pesticides, and minimum use of fertilizer. In fact, you use what is available on the farm, what we call circular economy, so that you don't even have waste on your farms. So if you look at it from that angle, you might be able to see that one of the misconceptions is that agroecology is actually expensive. And the other misconception is that organic agriculture, actually because it also comes with standards that require a lot of money to, to be certified organic. You have to pay, I think, 13,000 euros or something to be able even to export something to Europe that is organic. But in Uganda, actually Uganda is one of the countries where most of the food is still organic, if I'm not wrong. But if you go to a Ugandan farm, there is a lot going on in terms of the diversity of crops. There's also a lot going on in terms of the circular economy that I've been talking about. So these are practices that are already existing, but we as scientists have failed to document them. And I would like to say that at the CGIAR where I belong, we now have a new program of work called Multifunctional Living Landscapes, where we are promoting agroecology. We are promoting landscapes that are living, that look at tree biodiversity, that look at crop biodiversity, that look at insects and bees and pollinators, and how these interact ecologically, and how we can benefit from circular economy, and then how it can benefit people. Because agroecology is people-centered. It has to be a bottom-up approach in terms of the movement towards transformation. It will have to start from the bottom, and it will have to start from us, ordinary citizens. And then we link this to what is happening in terms of policies and regulations. If there is no bottom-up movement, we will end up making policies, and we have made them. In Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, we have agroecology strategies or policies that are sitting in shelves. Nobody is implementing them because there is no that bottom-up transformation. So what must we do in that case? We must start to decolonize our minds and our plates first and foremost. I will keep insisting on this because food transformation, transforming the agriculture, transformation at the agricultural level will start from what we are demanding. If we are still demanding chapati and bread, we are not going to transform anything. We will still have to import wheat to meet our demands for chapati and bread. So we must also start creating awareness, even for our children in schools, about importance of local foods and importance of opportunity crops. We must bring back opportunity crops. And this, I'm calling them opportunity crops because I don't want to call them orphaned or neglected. Those are derogatory terms. These are crops of the future. They contribute to climate resilience. They contribute to dietary diversity. They contribute to health. These opportunity crops are the key towards transforming our agriculture here in Africa. And we must not forget the people that are called the farmers. We must start transforming our farmer systems to reflect what is really ideally happening in the continent. So I rest my case.
Okay, before you pass the mic, let's hear from Mary first, as you conclude and you respond to some of those pending questions, but also helping us about the consumers. What's their role in enhancing this? Because like we're having an earlier conversation, if you go to our open air markets or agricultural markets, you don't see anything labeled there that this is agroecologically grown. You just see leafy vegetables that are rich in color.
Yeah, I mean, I think consumers play a bigger part in changing the food system. There is one way we can go through research, policy, but one of the ways I think that will change how farmers are farming is if the consumers demand agroecological food, or call it organic food, or food free from chemical and pesticide. If you demand it, we'll grow it. Every farmer is looking for a livelihood, and they don't pay attention to this new system because one, it is knowledge intensive. It requires them to learn a whole different thing, and two, the market does not appreciate it. But I found that when a market appreciates this food, you convert the farmer pretty easily. And this is the kind of work I have begun to do in my county, growing a group of people interested in farmers who are farming sustainably without synthetic fertilizers and without chemicals. So the consumers, you make a difference. Secondly, I think we have failed to address the issue that we are growing food, but it's not nourishing food. Food can fill the belly, can make us obese, but to nourish us is a whole different aspect. Nourishing food only comes from nourished soils. If we do not address that factor and we don't place it anywhere,
change, as long as we empower the agroecology farmers by reviving extension services and then incentivizing them. And these incentives could be in form of policies, preferences, issues of access to market, and then like in the law, we are also going to demand designated cross-border markets for agroecology produced food, so that you know where it is, and then you label it. You go to a counter in a retail shop, and then you find this is agroecologically produced. So I think we need to lay those fears that they cannot exist anymore. To answer your question about policies needed urgently to encourage young people to join agriculture. You know, agriculture is social, economic, and livelihood. So all this kind of thing is about agriculture. So you cannot live minus agriculture, whether it is produced by somebody else or you. So the choice is yours, whether you will be the stakeholder, the one producing your own. So you begin with agroecology farming. So when you started your agroecology farming, you will find the success and difficulties. For us now as legislators, we are working to resolve the issues that were seen through the experience of the agroecology farmers. So we are filling the gaps in terms of law so that the agroecology farmers are protected and empowered. Law will come to look for you as long as you have gone to the field to start your agriculture. Please, you start your agriculture right away. Now to conclude, to wind up, I think I'm concluding, is that not many people in East Africa, for us, we are still thinking East African community is a very unpopular project in the villages. Nobody knows because we have not done enough sensitization. It is known in the capitals. It is not well known in the rural areas. So we think we need to really increase and maximize the engagement with the agroecology movements to extend our engagement to the rural communities, not in the cities, so that we inform our population. So we need to also expand the conversation. Really, the national parliaments and they need to be really engaged to be on board. And this is a step that we are taking with our civil society members, that we shall be engaging the national parliament so that they move together with us, because they are the one going to the constituencies. For me, my constituency is the national parliament of South Sudan, because I was elected by the members of parliament. The members of parliament have their own constituencies. So I should go with one of them to their constituency to be able to sensitize people. So I think that is the level we need to go. Otherwise, I thank you very much. This has been very, very informative. Yeah.
All right, thank you so much. Prof, your views, but also it's, should I say, I call the mover to respond?
So I want to briefly respond to the three questions and then share my vision for the future. So the first gentleman asked about how will we incentivize farmers to change to agroecology? And I would turn that around and say, why don't we stop incentivizing production agriculture? Because it's not a fair competition at the moment. And I think it's very important to recognize that if you go back to the colonial period, African farmers didn't just wake up one morning and say, I want to do production agriculture. It was a brutal transition. People did not want to engage in the system, they had to, in some cases there was forced labor, in some cases there were head taxes. You had to create this need for cash in order for people to make that transition, and then this gets reinforced in the post-colonial period. So I can't speak for Kenya, but I just spent the last 10 days in Tanzania, and if, you know, the ag extension services are totally in bed with the Green Revolution approach. That's what they are promoting. The government is subsidizing inputs. I think it would be a fairer playing field if we stopped that and began to present agroecology as